Right, here we go. And if the sound doesn't work, then just wave at me.
We have the talent, our youngsters are gallant, Corinthians from Manchester. Hooray!
Cool.
Oh, yeah, great, thank you. So that video is where oral history has taken me more recently, and I'm going to come back to it at the end of the presentation. But I wanted to start with it because it's taken sort of 23 years to get to where I've been doing reunions with groups of players rather than talking to individual women. And those methodologies, the reunions became particularly significant since 2018, and again became more significant still during lockdown and COVID, when we conducted them online to counter digital exclusion, social isolation and loneliness. So I want to sort of come back to where that is, but I thought it was important to start the presentation with something that was joyful, because women's sport is often a site of pain and contestation for many women who experience discrimination while playing it. And that affects the form of oral histories that we get. And the reason that a lot of women put up with that contestation, difficulty, derision, being put in a secondary position in relation to sporting bodies, is that they get an enormous amount of joy from sport. And that's really where I wanted to begin my presentation, because that's the thing, the joy, the fun, the comradeship is what makes it worth it. So again, for Rough Girls, foundational monograph, why oral history remains a vital methodology for recovering women's sport history. Next slide, please, Emily. I wanted to aim this first part of the presentation at people who are conducting oral histories now. Maybe you're doing your PhD, or maybe you're doing some work on behalf of a museum. But if you're in the beginning processes of this, the first couple of slides are particularly aimed at you, because you may think, A, why am I doing this? And B, it seems too hard. I'm working on my own on a particular project and I don't really know why I'm doing it or what the outcome of this is going to be. And just to say that if you are having those kinds of feelings, that's where I was back in 1997. So how it started was that I did an MA in literary theory and practice. I thought I was going to become a Toni Morrison scholar, actually. So I looked at the Black feminist literary theory of Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and other literary theorists, because my background was literature rather than history. So I've always found history as an academic subject something of a conservative field in which to work compared with the work that I've done previously in literature. And it changed in 1997 when I got a job at De Montfort University in Leicester, basically to lead their education studies degree. And they said to me, well, if you're going to work in a university, you'll need to do a PhD. What are you going to do a PhD in? And at that time, it began as the literature of football. But very quickly afterwards, my supervisor said to me, well, Jean, you play football, you're chair of a league, you do your coaching badges, you do this, you do that. You're never in because of football. Nobody's ever written a history of women's football before. Why don't you just do that? So I couldn't even pretend that it was my idea. And the PhD changed as a result of that. Nevertheless, back in 1997, not many people were talking about women's football. So I would go to social events and parties, and people with proper jobs like nurses and doctors and, you know, people who deliver the post would say, what are you doing with your time? And I'd say, I'm doing a PhD on the history of women's football. And they would say, you're doing what? That shouldn't take you very long. And all of the other kind of jokes that you could imagine that I received at the time. Nevertheless, I also went out in 1998 to Namibia to a World Conference on Women in Sport. And I conducted some field research in Namibia because I wanted to address my own white, Western, middle class, although really I consider myself to be working class. I was working in a university, so I have to concede that, you know, it's a middle class occupation. If I felt that I was having certain difficulties playing women's football at that time, what was it like to try to play women's football in Namibia? And so that was a really kind of instructive field trip, but it also meant that I met people in FIFA who at that time were trying to have a greater commitment to women's football. And I ended up working with them and co-authoring the Los Angeles Declaration on Women's Football, which was launched in 1999, which gave me a certain number of ins to the international community around women's football, which obviously was just so invaluable to be invited in. PhD submitted, and then the PhD, by the way, was not very good. I don't consider it a particularly brilliant PhD. And I think it's important to say that. And I'll talk about why I don't think it was particularly good. But again, for Rough Girls was my response to feeling that the PhD wasn't particularly glowing. And I think it's a book of which I remain really, really proud. And it was based on oral history techniques. Then I got funded by FIFA in 2003-05. Funded by UEFA in 2009-10, academic expert to the National Football Museum. And again, you see somebody, if you're early career researchers or you know, you're in the process of thinking of doing that, you see somebody now who's retired from university to pursue my consultancy work, because, you know, in 2020, 2021, universities were difficult places to be and continue to be so. So that's where I'm at now. I'm consultant for the FA and UEFA on the Women's Euros for all 10 host cities, and I've written books, co-written books for FIFA. So I'm trying to make a go of it outside of academia. I'm not sure how it's going. I think it's okay, but we'll see. Next slide, please, Emily. So I came to oral history really as a feminist and as a trained teacher. So I think it's important, and I don't think it's always done in an oral history context, to be both a reflective and a reflexive practitioner. And what I mean by that is, obviously, we're going to reflect on relations of power and the relationship between the interviewee and the interviewer. We're going to reflect on issues of how to transcribe the material, how correct we're going to make the English, and how we're going to basically translate words that were said in an interview onto the page, and those relationships of power that the researcher mainly holds. But also to be a reflexive practitioner, because I'm very concerned to articulate the kind of feminist that I am. And I think given the background that I have, you can understand why that would be, which is I don't accept, and I always challenge, and it makes some people really, really grumpy, but I think it's important to do it anyway, which is I don't accept the kind of liberal feminist discourse that's developed in the press and in a lot of academic papers around women's sport. And the liberal discourse, as I call it, is that women's sport is making constant progress. I always ask, progress towards what? Because when we adopt, we need to really pay attention to the kinds of language that we use when we discuss women's sport. And I drew attention to this in, again, for Rough Girls. You know, we talk about football and we talk about women's football. We talk about sport and we talk about women's sport. So already sport is subject to that modifying women's. And I think we should be doing more as academics to contest what that women's modifier means. Is it indicative of ownership, or is it indicative of placing women's sport or women's football as subaltern, secondary, lesser than? Because if you think about the narratives and the language that's used around men's sport, it's more than. Men's sport is too much, they earn too much money, it's too commercialised, it's too this, that and the other. So I think we need to be reflexive practitioners, and an analogy that I use with my students is, you know, liberal feminism. If feminisms were biscuits, liberal feminism would be a rich tea biscuit. You know, you dunk it once and it dissolves because it doesn't stand up to kind of robust challenge. So the feminism that I embrace is more radical than that, particularly around language, divided and gendered labour markets and the policing of those labour markets. But when I started in 1997, I hadn't got enough data. But what I did have was that I was totally networked. I knew people within women's football, and that included older women within women's football. Those individual gatekeepers were vital, and my subject knowledge as an insider to the culture was vital. And I'm often asked to speak on the subject of, you know, could a male researcher do what I do? And of course they can. Male researchers can conduct excellent feminist, intended oral histories. So I don't perceive those kind of gender boundaries, but I think it has to be reflective and reflexive in the way that it's done. Doing oral history is very time intensive, which I'm sure everybody on the presentation will already know. And I worked part-time at the university, 0.7, to fund travel and research. So it wasn't a funded PhD, it was something I totally did off my own back because I needed it for the job. I encountered, I'm sure all the speakers will have this, but I encountered various ethical questions they don't teach on methods courses. So without getting into anecdotes, for instance, my lovely husband used to drive me all over the country while I was doing this research at weekends, and we'd chat in the car and then I'd go off and do the research, and we'd sort of have a day out doing this research. However, there was a lady in Preston that I visited who didn't allow men into the house. So although he photographed things for me, he was made to do it in the garden. And I conducted an oral history interview with this woman, and it all seemed to be going okay, if a little bit, how can I say, it was slightly strained because Simon was outside in the garden. He could see us doing the interview, but he was kind of removed, and I didn't know how I felt about him being treated like that. And suddenly the lady changed the narrative and said, oh yes, the player of whom we were talking, I don't know if you can smell the smoke. She's sitting in that chair over there having a cigarette. And I said, excuse me? Oh yeah, can you feel her presence in the room? I'm sorry, no, actually I can't. So as a researcher then, I've got to decide to go along with what the person is saying or not. And she asked me to leave at that point. So no methods course that I've ever been on actually discussed that. And I think there are lots of micro decisions that you have to make almost on the hoof around oral history and your relationship with that person, as well as the kind of macro decisions that you have to make about what kind of feminist you are and what you're going to bring to that. I also had certain things happen to me during the PhD. For instance, there was a threat that my lead supervisor was going to be made redundant. And for a time, understandably, and I supported him as a colleague, he withdrew his labour from the supervision. It also meant that my second supervisor, who was on a fixed term contract, was let go and got a job at another university and didn't want to supervise me anymore. So partway through the supervision process of the PhD, I was sort of supervisor-less for a period of time. And I think, again, if you're in an ECR and you're in that situation, it's important to say that you can use the various processes that you probably think are really onerous around annual reviews and those kind of processes to manage up and ask for support and help, particularly to get towards completion. So I just thought it's worth saying that nobody gets an easy ride on a PhD, and life happens to you while you're doing a PhD. And the other thing that I always raise as well is that I lost my mum. I had to make a decision whether to continue or not. And I think that managing your mental health during the PhD is not something that's optional. So life will happen to you while you're doing your PhD and this research. And also it impacts directly on the oral histories, because certain things that people are going to say will stir up emotions within you while you're conducting those oral histories. And I think we talk very often about the kind of relations of power in terms of the researcher having the majority of power in those situations. But you need to be very conscious, I think, especially if you're new to this, of managing your mental health and managing how some of these things are going to make you feel. And one of the Corinthians that I showed in the film that I showed at the start of this presentation stirred up those emotions in me as soon as I met her. And it took me about 3 interviews with her for her to open up to me about, I just knew as soon as I met her that she was sad. And it made me cry instantly when I met her. And it took about 3 interviews with her for her to tell me why that was. So just be aware that it's a particular kind of methodology. It's not as cold as reading minutes, I should perhaps say. Next slide, Emily. One of the things that I think that we can particularly do with this in terms of oral history is thinking about the power of archives. So I don't know how many people on this call know anything about the history of women's football, but it's particularly a sport with its own damage, shall we say. So we know that early women's football, modern women's football, had matches from 1881 onwards. There were something like 160 matches with the British Ladies Football Club in 1894, 1895. Particularly important during World War I, there were 150 teams in World War I. And then in 1921, the FA banned women's football from its grounds for about 50 years. The Women's Football Association was taken over in 1969, and women's football has gradually grown since then from about 44 clubs onwards. These women, the Manchester Corinthians, are indicative of the teams who played during the ban. So not only were they kind of derided for wanting to play football as an enthusiasm, they were not allowed to do so on major grounds. They had to train on Fog Lane Park. They had to wash in puddles. Anything that you could do to make it unattractive as an activity was done to these women, and yet they loved to play football. And what really interests me in terms of oral history is why bother? You know, why bother? It'd be much easier to go away and do something else. And yet at the same time, football is relatively trivial compared with other aspects of women's lives. It's not their jobs. It's not perhaps even a key part of what most people will perceive to be their identity. And yet it is a key part of the way in which they see their identities. And that's what makes it particularly fascinating for me. So we know that there is very little archival information around women's football within the archives. And that is kind of privileged within academic history as a source for historians. The traditional study will be archival. And so oral histories, collecting those oral histories individually and collectively, along with the object-based research, and getting that into museums, archives, galleries, libraries, art galleries, all those kind of sites of power is particularly important. And that's the kind of work that I've been doing more recently. Next slide, Emily. I'm just going to draw it to a close. So I started out with the problem of too little data. There was very little within the archives, and I was almost forced into using oral history, which again, for rough girls, really, really did at the time. But now there's a problem of too much data. There are a lot of people writing about women's football and women's sport, broadly from that liberal feminist approach, that everything's getting better, be celebratory, don't be critical, don't engage in that kind of critical analysis. It's a kind of rah interpretation of women's sport. I think one of the things to say about that in terms of where we are now is that the subject area should be a welcome space, and don't get distracted by the drama. That's not to say that I agree with everything that is written, but I think it is really important to pick your battles. And one of the battles that people may or may not know about is this Emma Clark myth, which is an enthusiast historian, originally thought he'd located the first Black female player, football player in Liverpool under another name. He then revised his findings, seeing that it was somebody based in London. And having used, I know Amanda Callan-Spence on the call, so having used the expertise of really brilliant people who are a lot better at genealogical research than I am, and several of us have looked at this, we can't find any evidence actually that she got either Black or Asian history. So that has been a bit of a battle, because there is a plaque up to Emma Clark in London outside a school. And there are several things about that plaque that are wrong. So I think it's really about choosing your battles, and at the same time questioning when enthusiast history does get it wrong. I think you can revise your own interpretations at a later date without being wrong. So, this is a common misunderstanding about academic work. I think we refine our work as more data becomes available. And some of the things I wrote in A Game for Rough Girls, I wouldn't write now, but that's with the benefit of 25 years of hindsight. I feel very strongly that we shouldn't parachute in without giving back to communities. And I've talked to other colleagues who, I used to work with the excellent Lorna Chesham, whose research was not anything to do with sport. She looked at the Black and Asian communities in Leicester and how the narratives around that had gone from being immigrants to ethnic minorities. And a lot of the subjects who Lorna worked with said to her, you know what, we're a bit fed up of you academics. You kind of come in, interview us for our master's and PhD thesis. You don't give anything back to the community. We never get to read your thesis. It's another kind of form of colonialism. And I was struck by that very early on in my process. So I've tried to give back to individuals as I've gone around, in terms of, I will photograph their scrapbooks and albums and things, and then give them a little copy of those photographs in an album. So if future researchers come round, they can show them that and don't have to keep getting out the original scrapbook, which is getting more and more tatty as the years go by. So I do that to individuals, as well as the kind of reunion work that you've seen with groups. And I think that we have to be conscious that there are different feminisms, and conscious that we're in male-dominated academic discourse. 25% of female history professors 25% of history professors are female. And again, if you are a Black or Asian female academic working in those those disciplines, it's going to be even more difficult to progress your career. So we have to be an ally to people and understand what the structures of their academic career chain can be in order to accelerate people, rather than just think that people can get there on their own. Next slide, Emily. I'm going to draw it to a conclusion now. So this is what I'm currently doing, and the reason that I think this is celebratory and kind of speaks to the presentations today is I was asked to do a keynote in 2005 when the FA last hosted the Women's Euros, and the FA at that time paid a guy who was a consultant to look at the legacy of that tournament, and he was paid quite a lot of money to conclude that there would be no legacy of that tournament because there was nothing in place. And guess what? Do you know what? He was right. But the ethos of the FA has changed in that time, in the last 17 years. So they now accept that the history of women's football is important and does need to be released. So there's been a change within that organisation of being defensive about this 50-year ban that took place to now wanting to celebrate women's history. And oral history is a big part of that. And it's a big part of the contemporary collections that are going on across 10 host cities. So the host cities will support their local programmes with a highlight national event. We've got the London Philharmonic Orchestra involved. There will be artists involved. Galleries, libraries, museums will be involved. This story will be told in fan zones that people can go to before and after the matches. And we've got a £3 million Arts and Heritage programme supported by National Lottery Heritage Fund and a number of others. So we'll be using that to tell and celebrate the hidden history of women's football in a very public way. There'll be monoliths in public areas, and there'll be different art forms and different installations and exhibitions that will be in the fan zone. So we almost want people to learn about the history in a kind of ambient way. And oral histories are a big part of that. There will be recordings of key women. It's to support post-pandemic recovery, support and develop local creative sectors. And there will be things like walking football tournaments where people can bring along their memorabilia. So we're trying to do really innovative ways of collecting those kinds of oral histories and relating it to object-based research. And in light of that then, I think we'll just show Manchester Corinthians one more time. So as said, we did this work, probably worth saying that the book that you see there is a popular history book. It's not an academic title. And again, I've used oral histories extensively in there of Manchester Corinthians and the women who went to the unofficial Women's World Cup in Mexico in '71. And having started those reunions in 2018, we continued them online, and we trained some of the older women to use things like Zoom, and we bought them iPads to counter digital isolation and loneliness and those kinds of things. And now we're back to in-person reunions. So I think we'll end on a joyful note.
We have the talent, our youngsters are gallant, Corinthians from Manchester. Hooray!
Ability at Bournemouth University. Raf's work bridges the gap between contemporary cricket and the history of cricket, as well as other sports, with a particular interest in gender. So Raf, if you want to share your screen.
Thanks so much, Emily.
No worries.
Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Great. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, as Emily says, I'm currently working as a senior lecturer at Bournemouth University. I've been carrying out oral histories for about 10 years now, I think, so not as long as Jean. It's actually really nice, though, to be speaking on a panel with Jean, because she was one of the examiners for my PhD thesis. I don't know if she remembers, but it was certainly a very memorable day for me. Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about my experiences of oral history, first of all. So oral histories were a fundamental part of my PhD thesis, which looked at the history of women's cricket in Britain. I interviewed, it was 27 English women who played international or county cricket, and those interviews were then supplemented and made up a big component of my book, Ladies and Lords, which was published by Peter Lang in 2019. And more recently, oral history has also been a cornerstone of my current research project, which looks at the period between 1985 and 2000, when women's sport in the UK transitioned from being run independently from men's sport to being run by the same organisations as men's sport. And for this research, I've interviewed both women and also some men across a range of sports, including squash, football, athletics, lacrosse, hockey, and cricket. And it's these experiences that are going to inform what I'll be talking about today. I think that where my presentation may differ from, or certainly from Jean's, but also perhaps from Lydia's, is that my work is an example of using oral histories in combination with archival material. As Jean was saying, at the time that she started doing her research, there was really very little women's football kind of archives around, whereas and I thought that might also be the case for women's cricket when I started my PhD, but I actually discovered that the Women's Cricket Association, which was the governing body of women's cricket, actually had an entire archive devoted to their sport, although it was being kept in quite unconventional fashion when I discovered it. So this was the Women's Cricket Association at the time, archive at the time that I found it. It was being stored in a cowshed, basically a glorified cowshed in Lancashire, in the home of a former England cricketer. It's now safely ensconced in the MCC library at Lord's Cricket Ground in London, so it's being probably slightly better preserved than it was at this point. So my oral histories with cricketers were to supplement the archival material that I found, and the more recent research on multiple sports also relies on combining oral histories with archival material on various different sports at a number of archives, including the British Library, University of Birmingham, University of Bath, and University of Bedfordshire. I've been able to utilize this combination of oral histories with traditional archival material, which perhaps kind of begs the question of why, if I could have just gone down the route of kind of looking at the archival material, why I bothered with oral histories when, as Jean says, it is such a time-consuming methodology. The top reason that people often talk about is that it's about kind of cross-referencing or being able to triangulate between different sources, which is true, but not really what I'm going to be focusing on today, because the second two reasons on the screen are the ones that I'm most interested in. The point about oral history really is it's about emotion, feeling, and meaning, and this is kind of totally relating to what Jean was saying about how when we do interviews, it can really stir up emotions within us that we weren't necessarily expecting. For me, these interviews it was really important that I captured the emotions and the meanings of cricket to women. And then the third point on the screen, I found oral histories also to be a way of accessing female sports people's thoughts and feelings about feminism and the feminist movement. And therefore that helped me as a historian kind of situate them within the broader women's movement in Britain. So most of the women that I interviewed lived through women's liberation, and therefore doing these oral histories kind of enables an insight into what Julie Stevens terms the emotional dimensions of feminist activism. So she talks about oral history as being important because it allows us to tell an alternative, effective history of the women's movement, which the written record doesn't really convey. She also says that oral history can work against fixed versions of feminism's history and allow more ambivalent dialogues to emerge. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, this ambivalence that sportswomen, and in particular female cricketers, tend to express towards feminism. So I'm obviously not the first historian to have made this point. I believe that Jean discussed it in A Game for Rough Girls, that often sportswomen throughout history have tended to have this really ambivalent relationship with the feminist movement. And this generally held true of female cricketers. Archival records, if we look at the 1970s, when second wave feminism really came to prominence as a social movement in Britain, the archival records suggest that female cricketers were not involved in women's lib, and they did not join any of the campaigns or participate in women's lib groups. And it's really interesting actually to think about why that was, and I think that in order to understand that, we need to turn to oral history. So I'm just going to briefly introduce you to one of the greats of women's cricket history. This is Rachel Hayhoe-Flint, who sadly passed away in 2017. She was the England captain between 1966 and 1977. She was also a journalist. She wrote regularly for the Daily Telegraph from 1967. And she famously in 1973 became the UK's first ever female TV sports presenter on ITV. She was instrumental in organising the first ever Cricket World Cup in 1973. And later in her life, she then campaigned for female membership of the Marylebone Cricket Club, which was only open until men until they changed the ruling in 1998, thanks to Rachel's long-standing campaign. So she achieved a great deal for women's cricket, but interestingly, she was actually quite unpopular with those in charge of running women's cricket. In 1977, she was fired from the England captaincy in quite controversial circumstances. So there's a real story there, and obviously being a journalist as well as a historian, I was really keen in the interviews to uncover the source of this antipathy. And this was a quote from one of the interviews I did with an administrator who was very prominent in women's cricket in the 1970s, talking about Rachel Hayhoe-Flint. And she said, she once chained herself to Lord's, I think it was. No, it wasn't Lord's. It was, where would it be? A bit like a suffragette would have done. And it caused absolute hell in the Women's Cricket Association because she was out of order and the women's cricket had to take the blame. I think it was the House of Commons, the Houses of Parliament or something. But that was typical. She was making a point which looked as though it was on behalf of the Women's Cricket Association and wasn't. And that was what we were afraid of all the time, because it clearly was not good for the image of the WCA. And it wasn't, one person shouldn't be judged, but because she was in the line of the newspapers and everything else, she was on television, she made the most of that, and it didn't help the association. So this extract tells us a couple of things just kind of instantly sort of jump off the page. Hayhoe-Flint was obviously associated with feminism in the minds of her fellow cricketers, and also this was perceived as damaging ultimately to the image of women's cricket and the WCA. So there's this real sense of a huge negativity surrounding women's lib as a movement amongst this particular group of sportswomen. And indeed, that was borne out in other interviews I did. So this was Kathy Mowat, who was an international cricketer in the 70s and 80s, and then later became chair of the Women's Cricket Association, talking about the impact of a strident women's libber having been negative on most cricket organisations, because actually what was needed was a softly approach and not being strident. You needed to be far more diplomatic than that. So yeah, there are some really interesting things in this particular clip about Hey-Ho Flint. But the really, really, really interesting thing about it is that this chaining herself to the railings incident never happened. As far as I can kind of, I obviously you can never 100% say that something didn't happen, but basically all of the sources, and you can imagine there would have been enormous press coverage if she'd gone and chained herself to the railings outside Lords or the Houses of Parliament. So that never happened, and that's really, really striking. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about that for a minute, really, because I think it shows the value of oral history, and it not just in a kind of way about triangulation of source material. So it's true that Hey-Ho Flint did adopt this kind of discourse of equal opportunities and a little bit of feminism in her work. So this is a story from the Daily Mirror in December 1975, where basically she was talking to a journalist and told them that she planned to report the MCC, who own Lord's Cricket Ground, and to report them to the newly formed Equal Opportunities Commission for alleged sex discrimination. And this article was kind of basically on her side, saying that it's the Marylebone Chauvinist Club, and it was really unfair that women had never got to play there. So she was kind of, she was drawing on some of these sort of tools of second wave feminism that were being put in place, but she never chained herself to any railings. And I think that there are some interesting parallels here with the work of Alessandro Portelli, who's an Italian historian of who uses oral history, and he went and interviewed a lot of Italian survivors of the Second World War in the immediate post-war period, and he talks about a lot of them in interviews talking to him about recalling the bombing of Italy during the Second World War, and that they'd convinced themselves, and they said in interviews, it was the Germans who were bombing us. And obviously it wasn't, it was the Americans. But he says that because of this kind of post-war discourse of Germany and Nazism and fascism as being evil and the Allies as being the good guys, it was impossible for people to believe that it was the good guys who'd bombed them and destroyed their homes and killed their family members. And he concludes that actually, even though people were saying kind of wrong statements or things that we know to be historically inaccurate, those wrong statements are still psychologically true. And this truth is equally as important as factually reliable accounts, because the joy of oral history is that it tells us less about events than about their meaning. So the meaning of this quote then is that in the minds of this interviewee, and in the mind of this interviewee and probably also in the minds generally of female cricketers, Rachel Hey-Ho Flint was a radical feminist. And the specific tactics that she employed matter less than the fact that she was seen as being prepared to go to great lengths in the name of feminism, and this wasn't helpful for the public image of women's cricket. And so this is a good example of the kind of worth of oral history. It's providing me with a solution and an answer to this dilemma about why Hey-Ho Flint was so unpopular. But it's also, it shows us that even when interviewees are describing events that we know didn't occur, oral history is helping us to understand perceptions and emotions, and particularly in relation to feminism in this case. Another thing that was evident from my interviews was the fact that the use of the word feminist, even just the use of the word feminist, could be an uncomfortable or a taboo word for many women at the time that these interviews were conducted. It might be different now, but I was conducting these between 2012 and 2014. So launching in with the question, are you a feminist, wasn't, as it transpired, a particularly effective technique in interviews with sportswomen. And here's Janet. I hope you can hear this.
Are you a feminist?
Oh, I wouldn't have said so, no. No, wouldn't have said so, no. Thanks.
Okay. I mean, if I said to you that people have labelled women's cricket as feminists, what would your response be?
Well, I'm surprised to hear that myself, but no, I wouldn't have said so. They don't. To me, a feminist is someone who is quite outspoken about things.
And I don't think women's cricket, any one person is outspoken about anything like that, you know.
So have any of the women that you played cricket with been feminists, would you say?
Oh, I wouldn't have said so, no. No, it's all burning bras, isn't it? I don't think any of them are like that.
So you can actually hear some of the kind of discomfort or uncertainty that I felt in this clip. I wasn't sure how to respond or where to take the conversation next when she basically shut me down about feminism, and then I tried to follow it up, and she was just like, no, not having any of it, basically. And I found that really interesting. I think that there are parallels with to some extent with what Susan Kahn says. She's talking about talking about lesbianism in the history of women's sport as a kind of taboo or suppressed topic. And she says that when we use oral history to break open taboo topics, we should remain aware that the language we use will signify historical and political meanings that will influence the interview process and our historical findings. And in my case, it was about kind of interviewing women who the word feminist stemmed, or then their negativity towards feminism and the word feminist stemmed from their experiences of kind of associating with bra burning and negative feelings towards men. And to me, wading into these interviews as a feminist academic, the word feminism doesn't have the same connotations as it does for the generation of British women who lived through women's lib, a movement which, as I found in the interviews, was clearly profoundly alienating for many of them. So I suppose in terms of kind of advice, I think that it's important to think really carefully about how we structure oral history interviews, and of course the language that we use to discuss particular issues. And we also need to make sure that we're flexible in our questioning strategy as well. So I found eventually that a better technique was to ask about the relationship of women's cricket and men's cricket. Or even, how did you feel you were treated in relation to the men? And then that would in turn lead to a conversation about equality more broadly, which could lead to thinking about feminism, but less explicitly. So this was part of my interview with Kathy. And I actually just said, oh, maybe there was a broader move in society towards equal opportunities. And she agreed and said yes, and equality. And then went on to say that she felt that women's cricket was a very good sport. We don't want to compete with the men, but we're just as good as the men. And then I couldn't help myself. I followed it up by saying, would you describe yourself as a feminist? And she said, no. So there's obviously still that kind of frustration for me in the interview situation of going, surely this is a feminist intent. These are feminist things that you're saying. And there's a clear commitment to equality that comes through in the clip, but she's still not prepared to accept the feminist label. The final point that I wanted to make today is that oral histories, I think, do allow us to see beyond this rejection of the feminist label and lack of involvement of female cricketers in second wave feminists or in second wave feminism. To see beyond that rejection, to understand the ways in which sport actually could still be a site of feminist activism. In that they allowed women to assert strength in the face of stereotypes about female frailty, and to reject traditional relationships and modes of domesticity as well. So here's Norma Whitehorn.
So when I go, the Whitehorn dynasty ends, unless I decide to get married suddenly, and I don't think I will somehow.
So you haven't ever been married?
No. Never had any inclinations. As I used to say, no, I'll take my hockey stick and cricket back to bed, thank you. And that was my way of life. I mean.
So Norma wasn't particularly uncommon here. So at the time of our interview, she was aged 82, and she was explaining why herself and large numbers of other women cricketers had remained unmarried. Her rejection of marriage was based on the fact that cricket and hockey were a way of life to her, and they were too important to risk having to give them up, basically. This is Enid. Enid did get married in her early 20s after finishing her teacher training, and she talked about her husband who initially encouraged her cricket and was quite happy with it, but tensions were caused when she decided, apparently independently, to go away on an international tour of Australia and New Zealand, and that was in 1968-69, leaving her husband to care for their daughter, who was then aged 3 years old.
How did your husband feel about you playing cricket?
He was quite happy to begin with, but I think it got, I mean, certainly he wrote during this 4.5 months tour, and he said, "No, well, this is too long," because my parents looked after Lorna during the week, and then he'd have her at the weekend. And I suppose it got, and then, as I say, when I opted to play for this men's team, he upped and left home. But he couldn't really do anything about it, because my first love has always been cricket.
Enid continued to go on international cricket tours right up until the 1982 World Cup in New Zealand, when she left 3 children, aged 15, 11 and 10, behind with her husband. So she was prepared to exert her own leisure preferences, even in the face of resistance from her husband. And to her, it made total sense, because cricket was her first love and was far more important. And similarly, that was also the case with Pat, who took up cricket in the late 1940s, married Steve in 1962, and went on to have 2 children. And this was a really interesting cross-generational interview. And in the clip, you'll hear the voice of Pat, the voice of her husband, Steve, and also briefly the voice of their daughter, Jan.
Has that ever been an issue for either of you in terms of having to stop playing when you had children?
Not if I wanted it not to be. It's just that, you know, you just sort of dictate to the men and they accept it.
Well, no, it's not right.
That's what I found.
I was there to be a taxi.
Yes.
I love meeting Steve. Cricket was also an important way in which women could challenge some of the discourses around the frailty of the female body, and also the idea that women were kind of naturally non-competitive as well, which I think that to some extent the women's libbers naturally bought into, which is one of their reasons for the rejection of sport. So this is Kathy, who was a fast bowler for England between 1978 and 1984, and I asked her what it was about cricket that appealed to her, and she said, well, as a fast bowler, the fact that I knew I could frighten people, which is a really interesting answer and slightly unexpected. So can women's cricket be identified as a site of feminism? Some of the crucial ideological elements of second wave feminism were challenging women's confinement, domesticity and unequal dependent marriage, female empowerment, giving women the power to control their own bodies. And what I found in these oral history interviews is that despite verbally rejecting the feminist label, and despite the archival material from this time suggesting that there really wasn't any involvement in women's lib, these women had absorbed some of the discourses of equal opportunities, and playing cricket could and often did pave the way for autonomy in other spheres of their lives. So just to quickly wrap up, what does oral history offer a historian of women's sport, even when there's a significant amount of archival material available? In my experience, oral history has revealed 2 key phenomena, a hostility to the term feminism, but also a reason for that hostility. The fact that these were the experiences of a generation of women who associate the term with bra burning and negative feelings towards men. And if we listen carefully to what they're saying, they're not talking about ideology or individuals within women's lib, they're talking about PR and public image. Cricket was also a way in which women could gain confidence, boost their self-worth, and it provided for some women a route to reject societal discourses. Had I not conducted oral histories, my understanding of these subjects would have been very impoverished, I think. And I just wanted to end by saying I feel really privileged to have been able to interview these women. Some of them had the chance to tell their life stories for the first and in some cases the last time, because since I carried out these interviews almost a decade ago, I think it's 6 of these women at the last count who have sadly passed away. And that's really the ultimate privilege of oral history, because we can spend hours worrying about how to go about it or what we're going to ask. But if we capture the stories of just one woman who otherwise wouldn't have had the chance to have her voice heard, then it's going to be worth it. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Raf. That was really, really interesting. I've got lots of questions written down for after. Just for coherence, we're going to go straight in for Lydia's presentation, and then we'll just do all the questions at the end, because I feel like there's going to be some really interesting discussions. So Lydia, if you're okay to share.
Are you just going to do a quick introduction to Lydia, Emily?
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I forget that not everybody knows everybody, and that I do. So thank you, Dr. Lydia First, for joining us. Lydia completed her PhD last year at De Montfort University. Her thesis was titled Women in Rugby Union, A Social and Cultural History from 1880 to 2016. And Lydia is actually about to begin a new role as the Education and Community Outreach Officer for the World Rugby Museum in Twickenham as well soon. So I think that will also be quite interesting in terms of discussion and questions, Lydia. So take it away.
Cool. Can you hear me okay, Emily?
Yes, perfect.
Fantastic. I think I've shared audio correctly. So we'll see if the sound bites come out. Let me know if there's any problems. But thank you all for having me here today and allowing me to go into a subject that I was a little bit frustrated with about a year ago when I was finishing off writing up my PhD, because I was struggling with how to write myself into and out of the PhD. Over 4 years, so I started in 2017, I conducted 28 interviews with former international women's rugby union players and administrators. And while the questions were, largely the same, every speaker had a unique and rich story to tell. But they all told their story to me, and I was reflecting on how that almost definitely impacted on which parts of their story they chose to tell in those all too brief conversations, which I had the pleasure of recording for posterity. So the work that I produced was shaped by my position as a women's rugby player, as an English, white, university educated, bisexual, cis woman, as a feminist. I'm going to address a few of these intersectional identity markers and how they impacted on my research today, considering, first of all, insider status, the debate about coming out or not during interviews, discussing race as a white woman with largely white interviewees, and reconciling the dislocation between my feminist researcher perspective and the rejection of the feminist label by many of my research participants. So we've got a lot to mirror with what Raf has just been saying as well. When I tried to include some of this discussion in my PhD introduction, my supervisor warned me against navel gazing. This picture is not me, this is a stock image, by the way. But the historian supposedly looks at sources objectively, whereas I found that other disciplines, particularly ethnography, anthropology, and sociology, offer a little bit more critical space to consider the researcher as subjective. So in an attempt to be interdisciplinary, I've designed this talk today, and I just want to spend a little bit of time reflecting on positionality during oral history interviews. And I've been really inspired by Carly Adams's 2012 article, which is very much on this subject. And I've put the reference on the last slide so everyone can go away and read that, because she says it a lot better than I'm going to say my bits for the next 15 minutes or so. So there's already quite a broad body of work which deals with the issue of insider and outsider positionality. As a researcher, there's always going to be advantages and disadvantages to either being within or external to the community with whom you're engaging. I'm a women's rugby player, not a very good one, I might add, but I know the game. I've over 10 years of experience within the sport, and I bring that to the research process. My insider status helped me to navigate certain networks and recruit interviewees, and also at times to create rapport with my interviewees. But I think one of the most important parts of doing oral history is, everyone will tell you, it's that you really need to listen. You really, really need to listen to what your interview is saying. And sometimes being an insider encourages them to gloss over points. You know, interviewees would often say to me, well, you know, as you know, oh, you know that. And I found it difficult, but a very productive exercise to make sure that when someone said, well, you know, we took the time to go back and unpick that, because I really did want to hear their own impressions rather than what they perceived to be our shared opinions. So it might be useful here to think about what anthropologist Patricia Zavella describes as an interview performance. The speakers were undoubtedly presenting elements of their story based on what they thought I wanted to hear. And we were both engaged in a form of performance, adopting an interview persona. The location of the interviews, my age, my clothes, and the way that I chose to introduce myself will have informed my conversation partners, and they will then have constructed a version of me as a researcher, as a women's rugby player, as a young white cis woman. And that will have inherently shaped how they narrated their recollections. So because oral history is an innately personal way of conducting research, it's all about the relationships that you build up with that person, often within quite a short time frame. And ultimately, relationships are between people. So that's why I think it's worth reflecting on our positionality. I feel so privileged that some of my interviewees shared intimate parts of themselves with me, including talking about their sexualities. I talked to straight women about the homophobic stereotypes of all female rugby players being lesbians. I talked to lesbian women about the homophobic or welcoming cultures of different rugby clubs. Some players mentioned their sexuality or made implicit references early on, which allowed me to follow up with questions. Sometimes these conversations needed to happen off tape. And I think it's really important to remember that that's still a part of the process. You can remember those moments, and there are some moments that unfortunately cannot be part of my archive, but touched me personally through the conversations that we had. But if people aren't out or do not want that publicly discussed, you have to respect that. I've got an excerpt here from a very different kind of conversation with a player called Lewissa Wall, who was a New Zealand player from 1995 through to the 2000s. And I apologise for the sound quality, but hopefully you can pick up. So in the moment of that interview, she was really open and honest with me and that's just the sort of person she is, but it elicited a very raw emotional response from me. And kind of, you know, linking back to what Jean said about taking care of your mental health, oral histories are very intimate. There's going to be moments that impact on things that you recognize in your life, or just emotionally. And it's something to think about as a methodology, that it is a very emotive way of doing research. And it really, you know, that honesty that she'd given me made me admit to her, like, sort of how it mirrored my experiences. And she was vulnerable, and I wanted to offer her some vulnerability in return, because it feels like an unfair exchange when people are giving something so important and so central to themselves, and you are often encouraged not to give as much of yourself in the interview. So I think sometimes it's okay, you know, if that's what you want to do, because oral histories, they're going to make you laugh and they can make you cry. You know, the subject of sexuality, I was asking my participants to make themselves vulnerable, but I was also opening myself up to be vulnerable. Because of that, I made a commitment to transcribe every interview and return full transcript to each of the participants, so they could maintain that sense of ownership, because it was a collaboratively created conversation. I was quite worried that people would withdraw sections or ask me not to use them. One of my supervisors encouraged me not to return transcripts to participants, but no one did. And I think it was a really important part of what I did. So I would encourage people to do that as well if you can. On another note, as someone who can pass as straight, I had a couple of interviews where I felt that the interviewees had interpreted me as heterosexual, and they made statements that may have been worded differently if they had known I was a bisexual woman. I wouldn't say I had any sort of hard and fast rules about which participants I came out to, because, you know, the whole term coming out is really problematic, but it was also, it's about making yourself vulnerable. And I've sometimes felt I needed to reciprocate vulnerability with vulnerability. Other times I didn't challenge the way that interviewees had constructed me, either as heterosexual or as queer, and this evidently impacted on our conversations. So moving on to reflecting on my interviews in terms of how I approached race, it brings me to two principal points: recruitment and whiteness as race. I attempted to recruit a diverse group of participants, but most of my European interviewees were white women. I was lucky enough to receive grant funding to undertake research in New Zealand, where rugby union has a mixture of both Pākehā, which is people of white European descent, and Māori and Pacifica players. These conversations about race in New Zealand were possibly the most productive, because I'd found that when I brought up race with white participants in the UK, interviewees interpreted the term race to mean racialised others. So this is a quote from Annie Freitas, a Scottish player with Portuguese heritage. And she told me that she was the token Black woman during her time on the Scottish team. And I'm afraid to say that I laughed. It was my very first interview, and I'd like to think that I got a little bit more professional as I did them, but she was able to explain that her identity as the exotic player within a group of white teammates made the most sense once we were talking about race, because this conversation being held between two white women, she had interpreted race to mean non-white. In comparison, in New Zealand, both Māori and Pākehā players discussed their own racialised identities, as well as referring to other players of different ethnicities. So I've got an excerpt here from an interview with Hannah Porter, who is a white New Zealand player, again, so it came to prominence in the 2000s.
Lydia, I can't hear that.
Try again. Better? No sound?
No, I think you're probably just going to have to summarise for now, Lydia, because I think there is just a slight issue with your sound. It's fine. Do you think you can just summarise?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I asked Hannah to speak about performing the haka as part of her, pre-match rituals and how she felt about that. And she described herself as the white girl at the back of the haka. She said that she deliberately tried to go to the back on the right where the cameras wouldn't be. And I later asked her to expand on how do you feel about being the white girl at the back of the haka? And she explained how the haka was an important part of her cultural identity. It was still part of her national identity, but she felt that she wasn't as naturally talented as performing it as others were. And she just wanted to not do her worst. Now, there's obviously a real loaded term in the fact that she's used the word naturally talented when we're talking about race. But even here, she's focusing more on explaining how the haka is part of Maori culture and how the haka impacts on her identity as a New Zealand rugby player and how that is affected by Maori culture, rather than her position as a white woman performing the haka. I think there's a little bit of a lack of ability to use terms to kind of have that conversation. But I think the gap is as interesting as what could have been said. Both race and queer are really sensitive subjects. So I generally tried to take the lead from interviewees and I didn't challenge them too much. I really wanted to hear what they had to say. And that was a really important approach for dealing with another sensitive subject that we've already heard from Raf from here, because I am a feminist researcher and I deliberately chose oral history as a feminist methodology, a way to collaborate with women and really give weight to their voices. My research has revealed intrinsic links between female participation in rugby and very early suffrage movements in New Zealand in 1891, first wave feminism in interwar France. And there is a clear temporal link between second wave feminism and the establishment of modern women's rugby, which really took off in America during the 1960s and got across the UK by the 1970s. And yet, as Raf has already mentioned with her experiences of women's cricket, oral history interviews revealed that very few women's rugby players were willing to self-identify as feminist. I'm going to try another quote. Let me know if the sound doesn't work, Emily, because this one is beautiful, but I will summarize if not.
Well, I think there's an element of justice. Think about that. I am very passionate about social justice. In sport, in terms of gender, sport, and all this stuff, I could just see that this was a glaring thing that just needed to be sorted out. It was going to happen, and I loved the game anyway. And obviously, I don't think you care initially, but I was meeting fantastic people, having wonderful opportunities, travelling, etc. But to have that all wrapped up was actually something to do with social justice. I was just like really special, So for me, that was the. If it had just been about any old game, then where there was no inequality or anything like that, then I couldn't really interesting. But because there was something to fight for, then it became really interesting. That's fascinating.
So that was Sue Brodie. I asked her about her motivation for supporting women's rugby in Scotland as an administrator, going beyond her role as a player. And incidentally, Sue Brodie organised the second Women's Rugby World Cup with 90 days notice because the original hosts pulled out due to a number of factors, but mostly interfering middle management men. In this clip, I was really intrigued by her use of the term social justice and the very careful avoidance of the term feminists. Raf, I can hear similarities between this clip and some of the ones you've played, that we're all talking about the same thing, but the language is very careful to not use the F word. Again and again in interviews, women told me about overcoming gender-based prejudices and fighting for their rights to play rugby, but almost no one chose to use the term feminist. Only one of my final interviewees, Sue Dorrington, who was an American who came to play rugby in England, and incidentally was one of the 4 women who organised the first Women's Rugby World Cup in 1991. She did interestingly have a moment where she self-identified as a feminist, which I'll play you a little clip from now. But I will say already that she didn't stick to this identity for very long. Hopefully you can hear this one.
I'm so embarrassed to tell you this, but I...
No, that's quite distorted, Lydia, sorry.
Sorry, you can't hear it at all? Or
no, it's very, very distorted to my view. I think if you just summarise and then we can pick up the questions from it later.
Oh, okay. Well, it was an interview conducted on Zoom. Unfortunately, it's maybe not translated very well here. But she says, "I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I was a cheerleader." She talks about her time as a cheerleader at high school and at university, and then she says, "But I gave that up to become a feminist." And she uses the words again a little bit later, "I was a cheerleader until I became a feminist." And so she's using these ideas as oppositional terms, cheerleader, feminist. And it took a little while in the conversation because she went into another story to come back to this point and ask her to kind of clarify about it. But in that moment, she was actually quite uncomfortable fully committing to the term feminist. It was kind of a case of, well, feminist with a little f. A kind of a rejection of feminist as a big political label. She didn't feel like that was an important part of her identity, whereas she felt quite strongly about rejecting the identity of cheerleader. That obviously represented something that she was happier to be a feminist than a cheerleader, but independently wasn't happy to be a feminist. As an overall thing, the interviews really made it clear that the women who laid the foundations for what the sport can be today largely did not choose to align themselves with the term feminist, which was further reinforced by the archival sources. So in newspapers, just as Raf said, really, but when women's rugby players were defined as feminist, it tended to be by anti-women's rugby media sources who were labeling the women as radical, actively seeking the destruction of social norms, as bra-burning lesbians, and it was much more usual response of the women's rugby players if they were actually quoted in the newspapers to reject the feminist label. So it really struck me that many of my interviewees had internalized this discourse that had been designed to protect themselves and their sport from the socially conservative media outlets. So that led me to looking at women's rugby as a site for both resistant and reproductive agencies. And I feel it's a much better representation of the different forces at play than a more simplistic view of, yes, women's rugby is feminist, and kind of, linking back to Jean's point about liberal feminism, it's not all about positive progress. It's about different things going forward and backwards and round in circles and up and down and sideways all at the same time, and thinking about these women's, like, really listening to what they were saying and really hearing how they describe their actions, whilst avoiding retrospectively applying a term that I can use with pride, but my interviewees don't. Sorry, there we go. So this is my list of my interviewees. These were the women who contributed to my research. They shared their stories with me, and it's their legacy that my work is intended to kind of record and celebrate. The interviews with former players and administrators were designed and undertaken as part of a feminist commitment to offer a history of women's rugby to the women's rugby community. And I'm delighted to say that there's an upcoming exhibition on the history of the Women's Rugby World Cups at the World Rugby Museum, which is entitled "In Her Own Words." And it's using quotes, many of which come from my interviews with these players, to again give the power back to these women. But today you've had to instead listen to me talking about my position within the interview. So I want to thank you for that time. And although it may have been a little bit navel-gazy for a historian, I really do think it's worth time, whatever our discipline, considering our own positionality both before, during and after the process of engaging with oral history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. And that exhibition sounds fantastic.